Is North Korea a blessing or a curse for China? This question might seem odd, but when you look closer, it's worth asking. North Korea's unpredictable actions and China's quiet support make for a complicated relationship. So, let's dive in and explore the hidden dynamics between these two nations. North Korea, a blessing or a curse for China? Let's take a moment to look at the recent developments between North Korea and China. On March 24th, North Korean media announced a meeting between the two nations' officials in Beijing, where they committed to strengthening their ties. Leading the North Korean side was Kim Song-nam, who represents the Central Committee of the Workers' Party, a group sent by Pyongyang to boost regional relations. Just days earlier, on March 21st, Wang Huning, one of China's top political figures, reassured Kim Song-nam that despite international tension, the friendship between China and North Korea remains unshakable. This long-standing partnership has been described as a strategic choice that both nations are determined to uphold. Earlier this year, North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, and China's President Xi Jinping exchanged messages, vowing to bring their countries even closer. But when it comes to North Korea's nuclear ambitions, their so-called special relationship tends to shift. International observers have their eyes on the potential for a seventh nuclear test by North Korea, with reports suggesting that Kim Jong-un has the final say on when it happens. The nuclear site in Punggye-ri has been prepped for action since early 2022, and the focus of this upcoming test is to advance North Korea's tactical nuclear warheads. China's growing concerns. For China, North Korea's nuclear ambitions aren't just political, they're a direct security threat. One big worry? The environmental risks. North Korea's nuclear tests have triggered fears of radiation leaks and earthquakes, especially in China's northeastern region. Punggye-ri, where the tests happen, sits just 80 kilometers from the Chinese border, putting millions of people at potential risk. Radiation levels are already a concern, with South Korean officials testing defectors from the region and finding elevated exposure levels in several cases. There's also the seismic threat. Previous tests have triggered earthquakes, and experts fear the next one could be even worse. South Korean reports suggest that Mount Paektu, an active volcano near the test site, is on the edge of erupting. If it does, the consequences could be catastrophic, potentially surpassing the historic eruption of Tambora in 1815. On top of that, China is grappling with the strategic and military implications of North Korea's nuclear advancements. The growing nuclear capabilities are pushing U.S. allies to step up their defensive measures, which could lead to more tension in the region. Some even argue that preemptive strikes may be necessary if North Korea's nuclear threat becomes too great to ignore. The impact on China's strategy. The mounting pressure from China has played a significant role in holding off North Korea's seventh nuclear test so far. However, what's especially alarming this time is that Pyongyang plans to test tactical nuclear weapons. While these are less destructive than full-scale atomic bombs, they can still cause devastating damage on the battlefield by targeting enemy forces with precision. From a military standpoint, it's likely that Kim Jong-un views these weapons as usable, with South Korea being his most probable target. But even though South Korea is in the direct line of fire, China is under significant pressure as well. Each nuclear test not only stirs up tension between North Korea and countries like South Korea, Japan, and the U.S., but it also puts the entire Asia region on edge. China, with its close ties to North Korea, often finds itself in the crosshairs of international pressure when Pyongyang moves forward with these tests. The global community, particularly the U.S. and Western nations, looks to China to manage and contain North Korea's aggressive nuclear ambitions. As North Korea's influence grows, so does the threat to regional peace and security, especially in Asia. China's growing concerns over North Korea. Despite the long-standing alliance, China is not thrilled about North Korea's nuclear advancements. A nuclear-armed North Korea poses a risk not just to the region, but to China's ability to maintain control over its volatile neighbor. The more powerful North Korea becomes, the more challenging it is for Beijing to keep Pyongyang in check. Chinese leaders understand that an unpredictable Kim Jong-un, backed by increasing nuclear capabilities, could destabilize the region. And Kim, being an assertive and determined leader, isn't someone who easily bends to outside influence when he feels his power is on the rise. This could drive a wedge between China and North Korea, cooling their once-warm relationship. Looking back at 2022, when global attention shifted to Ukraine, Kim Jong-un seized the moment to accelerate his nuclear and missile programs, reinforcing his determination to bolster North Korea's military might, regardless of international scrutiny. North Korea's bold moves. In early May 2022, North Korea made a bold claim. It had launched a new intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM. Interestingly, while South Korea, the US, and other world powers denied that such a test took place, North Korea's announcement was still significant. Why? Because it signaled Kim Jong-un's intent to restart North Korea's nuclear and ICBM programs after nearly 5 years of dormancy. Now you might wonder how China reacted to this. Well, they weren't too happy. The last time North Korea conducted an ICBM test, back in 2017, China didn't hold back. Beijing issued a strong condemnation, openly opposing North Korea's actions despite global disapproval. Beyond words, China also supported a United Nations Security Council resolution, voting for tougher sanctions on Pyongyang. They limited refined petroleum exports and banned North Korean imports like textiles and coal. It's likely that North Korea's decision to only announce the test this time, rather than fully carry it out, was influenced by China's disapproval. The consequences of the 2017 nuclear-capable ICBM test still loom large, and Pyongyang was well aware of the potential backlash from its powerful neighbor. The Chinese and Russian influence. Should North Korea continue pushing the envelope with its nuclear ambitions, China might take drastic measures that could severely impact the country. According to sources like Nikkei Asia, China views a nuclear-armed North Korea as a major threat to the regional balance of power. Wang Yang, a former Chinese leader, even went as far as to say that China could be the biggest victim of North Korea's growing nuclear and missile capabilities. What's really alarming Beijing is North Korea's increasing closeness to Russia, signaling a shift away from China. From Pyongyang's perspective, China has become more of an obstacle than an ally. China does not want North Korea to possess nuclear weapons capable of being mounted on ICBMs, especially those that could be aimed at its own borders. Here's the tricky part. With a single leader in charge, countries like North Korea are unpredictable. One day, Kim Jong-un might decide he's had enough of following China's lead. And in that scenario, who's to say he wouldn't turn those weapons on China itself? With ICBMs already in place, the risk is all too real. North Korea, a blessing or a curse for China? Even though North Korea's missile tests seem to be aimed at the US, there's no denying that China doesn't fully trust North Korea. And Kim Jong-un knows this well. Surprisingly, Kim himself isn't the biggest fan of China. He dreams of a North Korea that can break free from China's influence, and he believes the only way to do that is to push forward with his missile tests. Now, China won't appreciate being pushed aside like this, and they may respond strongly to Pyongyang's actions. But for Kim, it seems like a risk worth taking if it means boosting his country's ability to defend itself with nuclear weapons, perhaps even against China one day. The tension between these two nations is growing once again. While China continues to push for a denuclearized Korean peninsula, North Korea presses on with its nuclear ambitions. If we think about it, it's easy to understand why China is feeling nervous as North Korea advances its defense technology. A more aggressive North Korea, armed with nuclear weapons, is not exactly the kind of neighbor China wants. A complex relationship. The bond between China and North Korea is both a blessing and a curse for Beijing. North Korea, with its 420-kilometer shared border, acts as a buffer zone, protecting China from U.S. influence in the region. However, with North Korea's unpredictable behavior and constant threats of nuclear weapons, it's also a major headache. The relationship between these two countries has cooled significantly over the past few decades. North Korea may provide a layer of defense against the US, but it's also a volatile and dangerous ally to have. North Korea is fiercely independent and has been openly hostile toward the US and other regional powers. Its military acts as a deterrent but doesn't directly threaten China. So, from Beijing's perspective, having an ally like North Korea, one that finances its own defense and never falls under US control, helps secure a key part of their border. However, as North Korea's actions become more provocative, the relationship becomes more complicated for China. China's growing concerns. China is no stranger to threats near its border, but when you look at the map, it becomes clear why they're worried about North Korea's behavior. The eastern part of China is an economic powerhouse, home to many of its largest cities, including Beijing. Any conflict in the region could spell disaster for China's economy and security. If North Korea keeps provoking the US, it could force Washington to intervene, and that's a situation China wants to avoid at all costs. Some believe that China might even launch a preemptive strike against North Korea to prevent the US from gaining the upper hand. If China does decide to take military action, it could be the end for Kim Jong-un's regime, or any other leader in power at the time. But a military invasion of North Korea wouldn't come without severe consequences. The collapse of North Korea's government could lead to widespread chaos, sparking a humanitarian crisis. Millions could try to flee the country, and with the border to South Korea heavily guarded, many might attempt to escape into China. That would create another serious challenge for Beijing, one they'd much rather avoid. The migration dilemma for China. Imagine the chaos if millions of North Koreans suddenly fled across the border into China. The strain on resources like food, water, and shelter would be overwhelming, especially in regions already bordering North Korea. Public services would struggle to cope, and Chinese communities could face unprecedented pressure. But it's not just the humanitarian aspect. A massive migration could also pose serious security risks. With such a large influx of people, there's always the potential for crime and illegal activities to rise. Even worse, among the migrants, there could be North Korean agents or armed groups slipping into China, creating intelligence challenges for Beijing. On the international front, China would face immense pressure to handle the migrants with care and dignity. Human rights organizations and other nations would demand transparency and fair treatment. The world would be watching closely, ready to criticize any misstep. China's game plan for a North Korean collapse. China, always laser-focused on maintaining its internal stability, won't want millions of refugees flooding into its northeastern provinces. From Beijing's point of view, it's much more practical for these refugees to stay put in North Korea. This is why, if North Korea's regime were to collapse, it wouldn't be surprising to see the Chinese military, under the Northern Theater Command, quickly moving south to secure the border. Their main goal? To keep US forces out of North Korea. If this scenario plays out, North Korea could transform into a buffer zone controlled by China. Beijing might even set up a puppet government in Pyongyang to restore order and safeguard its interests on the Korean peninsula. In the worst-case scenario, China might decide to fully invade and topple the current regime, securing its grip on the region. A military power play. Looking at North Korea's military, it's clear that its main focus has been on the southern border, with about 70% of its forces aimed at South Korea. Only a small portion of its military is stationed along the Chinese border, leaving the regime vulnerable to an attack from its northern neighbor. On the flip side, China's Northern Theater Command is well-equipped and ready, with 3 powerful group armies, each with a mix of infantry, special forces, aviation, and artillery brigades. They could quickly cross into North Korea. Supported by 2 airborne divisions from the Chinese Air Force, this force could easily overrun North Korea's northern defenses and take control of strategic areas in the south. How would North Korea resist a Chinese invasion? If Pyongyang's regime remains intact, China would likely face some resistance. However, North Korea's limited fuel reserves could leave many of its military corps stranded, making it difficult to resist a full-scale Chinese invasion. In the event of a government collapse, the North Korean military might disband and become part of a starving, leaderless population. Beijing would ideally seek to establish relationships with North Korean military leaders before advancing, persuading them not to resist and maintain some semblance of order. It's hard to predict exactly how the People's Liberation Army, PLA, would fare in a large-scale conflict. The last time they engaged in such a battle was during the 1979 Sino-Vietnamese War, where they experienced heavy losses due to poor tactics against the battle-hardened Vietnamese. China's leadership, particularly Deng Xiaoping, vowed to avoid repeating such costly mistakes. Beijing would likely not launch an attack unless confident in the PLA's ability to execute it successfully. Though the PLA lacks the battlefield experience of more seasoned armies like the U.S. military, it is far more advanced and equipped than North Korea's forces. A simultaneous attack from China and the U.S. China's military has significantly modernized its equipment and strategies in recent years, with a focus on high-speed mechanized warfare. This modernization would give the PLA an edge in a strike toward Pyongyang. The most dangerous scenario, however, is if a Chinese invasion coincides with a U.S. and South Korean offensive moving northward from the DMZ. In this case, even though the U.S., South Korea, and China might be aiming for the same goal, neutralizing North Korea, their forces could find themselves in direct conflict. A clash between armies advancing from both the north and south would be a real possibility. For now, though, it's unlikely that Beijing will invade unless North Korea's regime collapses, as the economic, political, and military costs far outweigh the benefits. The Russia factor. From a geopolitical standpoint, Russia sees an opportunity in the strained relationship between China and North Korea. Russia and China share a long border, and while Russia doesn't want China as an adversary, it is cautious of Beijing's growing influence. Should China align more closely with the West, it would be a serious problem for Moscow. For now, Russia doesn't fear that China will become a Western puppet, but that doesn't mean Russia is entirely comfortable with China's ambitions. North Korea could serve as Russia's strategic counterbalance against China. In recent years, particularly after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the relationship between Russia and North Korea has warmed significantly. North Korea is pivoting toward Russia to diversify its partnerships and reduce its reliance on China. This shift poses several challenges for China. 1. Loss of influence over North Korea. North Korea has long depended on China, but if its ties with Russia deepen, it could weaken Beijing's influence over Pyongyang, shifting the power dynamics in the region. 2. Failure to control a key ally. As China and Russia's relationship becomes more complex, North Korea's growing relationship with Russia could make it harder for China to manage both nations, potentially creating tension between all three countries. 3. Rising tensions in Asia. A closer North Korea-Russia partnership could lead to increased instability in the region. With Russia expanding its presence in Asia, China could find itself facing new strategic challenges, both in maintaining its regional influence and in securing its borders. The future of the China-North Korea relationship. In this complex geopolitical landscape, every move by Beijing must be strategically planned. Whether North Korea remains an asset or becomes a liability for China largely depends on how Pyongyang shapes its policies toward its powerful neighbor. Despite the long-standing alliance between the two countries, China is wary of North Korea's nuclear ambitions. An uncontrolled escalation in Pyongyang's nuclear program could pose a direct threat to China's security. While North Korea serves as a useful buffer against U.S. influence in Asia, the unpredictable nature of Kim Jong-un's regime adds layers of uncertainty to the future of their relationship. At present, Beijing appears to favor a cautious approach, balancing engagement with control. They aim to maintain influence over Pyongyang without triggering instability in the region. However, as Kim Jong-un continues to push the limits of China's patience and build stronger ties with Russia, North Korea's increasing independence may eventually force Beijing to rethink its strategy on the Korean peninsula. Will China continue to play it safe? Or will North Korea's growing independence force Beijing to take bold action? Stay tuned to Eagle Discovery as we explore more about this ever-changing geopolitical landscape.